Welcome. Really glad you're here. I'm going to give it just a couple of minutes. I can see kind of like trickling in. I know it takes a minute sometimes to get Zoom going, so I will start slowly on this Wednesday morning. Hopefully, it's lovely and sunny where you are. I'm Lucy, COO at Stripe, and we run these sessions because the conversations that matter the most at work are usually the ones that feel like the hardest to start. And today, I think, is a topic that is very much one of those. We've got a fab guest joining us, Nigel Sarbutts, an amazing workplace mediation expert. Before we get into it, though, a couple of things. I did promise we'd start slowly. So, just as a reminder, because I appreciate everyone's meeting schedules works differently. So the session is being recorded and we'll send you the link out afterwards. So if you do have to hop off for another meeting, please don't worry. We would love for you to use the chat throughout. We always like these sessions to be here as much for you as possible. So any questions, please do make sure they go in the Q&A. You'll notice at the bottom of your Zoom webinar window. My words are already getting muddled today. There's a Q&A box. So if you have any questions for Nigel, please do get them in early. We have the ability to upvote questions. So do make the most of that. Get your questions in early and we'll try and pick up as many of those at the end as possible. We know that the Q&A will be busy today, so we've set aside lots of time for that. If you would like to, we would also love for you all to introduce yourself, say hi in the chat, let us know who you are, what your role is, where you're from, and anything you're hoping to get out of today. And as you're going through the webinar, any kind of reactions, things you're nodding along to, things that have surprised you maybe, we love to hear that in the chat. It's really useful for us just to see how things are going there. And like I say, the Q&A is open for you, so we'll have that live Q&A at the end as well. So just to help us kind of get started and understand a little bit about where you're at in your journey, we are going just to launch. I've just launched a poll, which should be popping up now. Do let us know. So and just like kind of answer those questions. So just kind of understanding a little bit about how where you're at in that kind of spotting conflict and handling conflict journey, and also that employee feedback journey as well. As I mentioned, I'm COO here at Stripe. We are employee survey software for fast-growing kind of SMEs. So we work with the likes of Newcastle United Foundation, UK Space Agency, and a few of your favourite zoos are in the mix of our customers as well. So we really help kind of take some of the faff out of surveys and make sure that when you're running those surveys, you really get direction and lots of information from your colleagues. So you're not just kind of I guess, elbow deep in spreadsheets, you're actually able to take that insight and do something with it. So if that is something you're interested in working with us on, we would absolutely love to hear from you too. And one last thing, this session is really designed to be practical, not really theory, not HR textbook, real situations, real decisions, and honest conversations about what actually works. So like I say, do get that webinar chat going, do get that Q&A going. That's where the real gems will come from today. Our brilliant guest, Nigel, finally time to talk about the reason we're here, is the founder of PR Cavalry and Structured Mediation, and he brings a really rare combination to this space. He spent years working in and around comms and creative industries, so he really understands this culture and the pressures and the personalities that come with these really high-performing teams that I know a lot of you are working in. Through Structured Mediation, he helps organizations navigate some of, I don't know, maybe we'll say the messier stuff, things like contractual disputes, shareholder disagreements, team dysfunction, and he brings a lot of clarity and from the few conversations I've had with him, a lot of honesty too. I wouldn't say you're a generic conflict consultant at all. I think you have a real eye for managing these tough conversations in a really diplomatic and lovely way. He knows your world, so please do make the most of the time of the hour that we've got together. I'm really genuinely looking forward to this one. And Nigel, over to you. And we have some slides to share, so I will just work on that now while you introduce yourself and get going.
Okay, well, thank you, Lucy, and thank you everybody for making the time to listen to this. I hope I can bring some value. If I cough and splutter, it's because I went old school a couple of weeks ago and got COVID. So
Oh,
I'm still on the back of that. So every now and again, I might just have a big coughing fit, but I'm fine, honestly. So yeah, very potted background. I mean, basically, three, I've been the MD of three comms agencies in my sort of previous career. I suppose. And as you know, I'm sure you can imagine, creative people they fall out quite a lot. They're pretty good at falling out with each other and creating conflict. And I think also, creative businesses are they work with their clientele in a slightly unusual way, and that the work is co-created. It's not really a supplier customer relationship. Work is created together, and so when disputes arise at a commercial level, they can become quite complex around who is more responsible, who is less responsible for an issue, and that certainly flows into conflict within the workplace and workplace stress. There's quite a lot of data out there around burnout rates in the creative industries, which is, a particular problem. But I'm going to focus really on that what it says there, the role and limits of workplace mediation, to try and put workplace mediation in context and try to dispel some of the myths about what mediation is and look at what the truths about mediation. So, if Lucy, you could just go to this slide and we just look at this the bare bones. That headline figure 28.5 billion comes, as you see, from an ACAS CIPD piece of work in May 2021, which looked at, and that report is downloadable from the ACAS website. Really good piece of work by Sheffield University, which puts the annual cost to the economy of workplace conflict at essentially 29 billion pounds. So this is 2021, when 29 billion pound was a lot of money. But and that comes into what are the components of that cost? Is, as you can see there, it's absence, turnover, and the associated cost of recruitment, that lost productivity of low energy work, of people who are not bringing their full selves to the job or the role, the management time trying to resolve conflict. And no doubt everybody on this webinar has spent a lot of hours, more hours than they would want to, in meetings with people trying to unpick problems. And then there's obviously the hard cost of where it ends up in tribunal, with associated legal costs, and representation costs as well. And Lucy, if you go to the next slide, please, I'd be grateful. But I think there are some, the unmeasurable impacts which don't go into that 29 billion, as if 29 billion was not a big enough number in itself. I think it comes down to things like key talent loss. And no doubt everybody on this webinar has had that moment where the star player just suddenly from nowhere says, I quit, I'm going, I've had enough, I can't work in this place anymore, I can't work with that person anymore. And a key player goes, and that brings not only the hard cost of recruitment, but the risk of replacing somebody who is integral to the business, and their replacement may not be as effective. I think there's definitely an issue around the internal and external reputation of management in dealing with workplace conflict. And I've worked on mediations. I did one not so very long ago with a CEO who couldn't be in the same room as his head of marketing, even though they'd worked together for 12 years. And one of the issues for him was that he had a strong perception of how weak it made him feel, or how weak he felt in the eyes of his colleagues, particularly his board colleagues, in not being able to deal with it. And that the where workplace conflict is visible to everybody in the office or in the environment, that definitely has an impact on the reputation of managers as leaders, as people who are able to solve and get out of problems. Psychological safety is definitely a driver of performance. That sense of, I am listened to and people act on what I have to say. And that may be something we touch on later with in terms of how the work that Strive does in researching employee opinion. And so psychological safety, there's been a lot of work done by Google as that psychological safety is a driver of high performing teams. That sense of the people around me know me, like me, and if I have a problem, I will be listened to and it will be acted on. And that distinction between being listened to and being acted on is the key element of that psychological safety. And customer loss, which is really difficult to pin down. Going back to my background of working in creative industries, if you have a low performing team because there's conflict, the work is low energy, people bring a little bit of resentment to the work in hand, and clients, customers, they can sense that. If they're working with a client team or their account team and they sense that there's division within the team, then customers can see that a mile off and they start to review who they're going to work with. So and that's very difficult to pin down. And one of the surprising things that came out of that ACAS CIPD research was that only 5% of employees have gone through a process of mediation where there's workplace conflict, and that it has a 74% success rate. So it's like there's this amazing tool available to managers, to leaders, but they're simply not using it, even though the data is there to show that it's incredibly successful at solving these frictions that are costing companies an enormous amount of money. So if we can jump to the next slide. So a couple of myths about mediation. There's definitely a feeling out there that it's just a nice chat, that it's getting together with some tea and biscuits and talking through problems without a particularly focused way forward. And that is definitely not the case. In a mediation, the heavy lifting is done by the participants. They have to bring a lot of thought to the process before the mediation meeting starts and during the mediation itself. They are doing hard work in that mediation meeting to try to map a way out of the stress or the resentment that is causing the conflict. It's not a judicial or an arbitration process. As a mediator, I do not sit in a room and say, do you know what, John, I think you're more in the wrong than Jane is. So, you need to do more work here to try to solve this. A mediator is entirely neutral. It cannot work if the mediator is not neutral, and a mediator is not there to arbitrate. They do not, at the end of the mediation session, say, right, I have decided that the way forward is that you, John, should do this, this, and this, and you, Jane, should do this, this, and this. The list of actions are developed by the participants, not by the mediator. So it is not an arbitration process. Neither is it an advisory process. And that's quite a challenge for a mediator, particularly someone like me that's come from an advisory sort of business, a consulting business. As a mediator, I can't sit there and say, do you know what, I've listened to you, and have you thought about doing this? Have you considered, that the way forward could be this? What the mediator is there to do is to enable the participants to reach those conclusions themselves through careful, open questioning in a structured way, which helps the participants to reveal what they really want out of the process, what they really want to do, to change, to solve the problem that they've come to the mediation with. It's not a place to vent. The mediation sessions can be, inevitably, they're pretty highly charged, but they're not a place for one person to say, start shouting or whatever, or to replay grievances. So a mediation will not go into detail in the mediation session about what has brought the two people together. There won't be a great pile of emails where we go through and say, well, John, you said this on the 1st of June, and then Jane, you said that on the 1st of July in reply, and go through in detail. That is kind of in the past. It may be referred to, the what has happened, and points of fact may be referred to in the mediation, but it is definitely not a backward looking process. It's all about looking forward and trying to map a way out of the problem which both participants feel that they can happily sign up to and that they feel is sustainable. And that's the key thing. And it is obviously not a disciplinary process either. It is not there to chide or blame or to go on to the HR record of either participant. The meeting is completely confidential. Nobody else is involved. And it's a key point to make this, that HR cannot be in the room when the mediation happens. And we can perhaps look at why that is. But yeah, it is definitely not a disciplinary process. So if we go to some of the truths. So how does it work? It is a structured process. There are steps to go through of private and joint conversations. The private conversations take place individually prior to the meeting, where I, as the mediator, over a phone call or a meeting, will dig into what has been going on, which has led to this point, and to try to begin the process of exploring what the individual thinks can be a way out of this problem, and to help them begin to think about a future looking way of looking at the problem. I understand completely that conflict in the workplace, it occupies your mind completely. If you're in deep dispute, a deep sense of resentment with your manager or with someone who reports to you, it is all consuming. You take it home, you talk to the cat about it, you start to be angry with your friend, your partner, whatever, because, I know how consuming that is. So those initial conversations begin to explore a future of how to get past that. And the mediator is there to be a completely neutral third party. I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm not an employee. Once the process has ended, I'm no longer involved in that. And so I can be completely neutral. I can help build trust, with the individuals, to say, that if you go into this with an open mind, with a desire to solve the problem, and that's a key element, there has to be a desire from both participants to try to solve the problem. If one party goes into it very reluctantly, then it's kind of a waste of time. And my job as the mediator is to help build trust in the process, and build trust that I am there to help, not to blame or to apportion who's right or wrong, or to adjudicate. It's very much an opportunity to be truthful about the present and the future. And what I mean by that is that mediation takes people on a journey. They arrive at the point of mediation with a position. I feel aggrieved for this reason, this reason, this reason, and the other person needs to do X, Y, and Z to solve that. It's about what the other person needs to do to solve my grievance. And bit by bit, what the mediation process does is to say, okay, well, I understand that that is your position, but what do you think a future can look like? What do you want out of that? What do you want out of this process? And in between there is, what do you need to happen for that desired outcome to take place? And that will be a shared responsibility. There will be responsibilities on both sides to make changes to get to that desired position. So there'll be some element of compromise. So it's an opportunity to be truthful about not looking backwards, but to be present, and the future is what you're interested in, what you're trying to get to the truth of the matter. And going back to that CEO, for him, it was like, well, how do I find a way to rekindle respect of my board colleagues in dealing with this problem? That was one of the key things that he hadn't identified until we got into the initial conversations, was actually at the heart of his issue. Um, so it's about forward-looking actions with both parties making decisions. So key question is always when to mediate, and it's fairly simple. It's a kind of there's the golden period between when informal efforts are no longer making progress, and there will come a point where you say, okay, this we're just not getting anywhere with this. But it has to be before formal disciplinary procedures begin or before irreversible positions have been taken. That somebody sends an email which has an absolutely irreversible position. If you don't do something by within 30 days, you will X, you will go into, third written warning or whatever it is. So there has to be a position where the management says, okay, we've done our best. We've had enough meetings now to know that we're no longer making progress. The progress that we made at the start of this has ended and it's trailed off, and now we're kind of in lockdown. But we're not yet. There is still something to be saved here. So we haven't gone down. We haven't gone in irreversibly. This is not a terminal relationship. And both parties, as I say, need to want to make progress. One party cannot be mandated to go into mediation. It would be just a complete waste of time. Both parties have to believe that a better future can be rekindled from where they are now. So if we go to the next slide. There are limits to mediation. It is definitely not a magic wand. If there have been clear policy violations, if there are harassment allegations, if that emerges in the middle of a mediation, I would have to stop it. I would have to end the meeting, because this could be an issue of criminal activity, and the mediation has to end at that point. And I would call it to a halt. If there are formal investigations going on or where safeguarding is a concern, particularly where there is a big disparity in power between one person in the mediation and another, where somebody is essentially using positions to bully. And mediation really, it can't close that kind of gap. That is an issue for HR to step in and to make difficult decisions around, about where this is clearly violated company policy, to the point where it needs to go to disciplinary and beyond. So what does success look like? The participants at the end of the mediation session, which could be a couple of hours, it could be all day. It'd be very rare that a workplace mediation would go on beyond one day. I mean, really, that would be a problematic situation. You would hope to conclude the mediation within a couple of hours. And the participants have decided what is a sustainable way forward. And sustainable is the key word there. It's got to be something that both participants, when they say, okay, well, having listened to you, having understood your position, and it may be the first time that one has really understood how the other person feels, that having listened to you, I can see that what I need to do to make this better is to change this, this, and this. And it has to be an act of change. You can't just talk your way out of conflict. There has to be a change in behavior by both parties. There has to be that key compromise, but it has to be sustainable. It has to be something that both participants believe will stick in 3 months, in 6 months, in 9 months, that they can both adhere to. The mediator captures those points, simply just jots them down, on a document in the meeting. That could be on a flip chart, it could be on a laptop, and both sign off on that. They both agree with the wording of what's been captured by the mediator, and they say, yeah, this is how we've ended this meeting, and this is what we both believe we can stick to. And then there is that option to revisit and check in on progress if the organisation wants. The mediator can come back in and do a health check in 3 months or 6 months or whatever, just to check in to see how it's going, to keep that sustainability, to keep both participants on track. And that's more or less the picture. So I hope that's been useful in explaining the process, what it is, what it isn't, and very, very keen to get some questions from Lucy or from the participants.
Thank you. And that was so interesting. My cat is actually, I'll point there, she's come and joined us on my lap, which is very, very rare for her to be doing that during a webinar. I think the thing that I really love every time I speak to you about mediation and how it works and um, everything around it is that it can feel like quite an overwhelming topic. It can feel quite daunting, quite scary, quite intimidating, and you make it feel very achievable, like there's a solution at the end of it, which I
Yeah,
think a lot of us will feel oftentimes that there isn't. Um,
yeah,
and that it's yeah, not actually quite, it can be quite a positive experience as well, which I think is nice.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, quite often in a in a conflict mediation, a workplace mediation, it is that moment of clarity where someone says, I had no idea you felt like this. I had no idea that my behavior made you feel like you do. And that can be an incredibly powerful, I mean, going back to that CEO and head of marketing, from that began with both participants, body language absolutely locked down, white knuckles, the whole thing. And 2 hours later, they were hugging, there were tears, there was, a box of Kleenex had to be found. Um, and, but, the big thing in that is, it can very often be the word sorry. Sometimes, when we get into conflict, be it with a customer or with a colleague, it does become all consuming. You lie awake thinking about it. We've all had those 3 a.m. thoughts where you're kind of composing an email in your head, or, even worse, you write the email and send it and then think, oh God, I wish I hadn't. But that you become so focused on your own emotions and your own perspective of the problem that having somebody listen carefully to what you've said with the in that safe space created by the mediator, that neutral space where that sense of trust hopefully exists. And that's briefly why HR can't be in the meeting, because ultimately HR represents the interests of the employer, so that they cannot, even the best HR person, the most objective HR person, still carries that conflict into mediation, so that they can't be involved.
Mm.
Um, but just having that trusted space where someone can say, I'm sorry, or can say, I haven't had the opportunity to say this to you face to face because I've been too scared or this, or I've been too angry to say these words to you. And that can be an incredibly powerful moment. I did say it wasn't therapy, but sometimes it does stray to that a little bit. But it can be as simple as I am sorry, and that can unlock a whole load um, of positive actions that come out of it.
No, I love that. And thank you. And I can see the questions are starting to bubble through. I can see some in the chat and I can see some in the Q&A. So we will pick those up. We've got a couple just to get started. I will also say keep popping them into that Q&A box.
Yeah,
You do have the ability to put them in anonymously as well. I appreciate this is a topic sometimes where it can be difficult to find the right way to ask a question, which then kind of stops us from doing it at all. So if you are wanting to ask anonymously, you can do that, I think, through the Q&A, or just make sure you toggle the chat just to us as panelists, and we'll be able to pick it up that way too. Um, okay, so I guess starting from the start, we've talked a lot about kind of some of the situations where you've worked with organizations in some really difficult moments. What is the most common thing HR managers wish they'd tell you they'd done sooner?
I suppose get involved. The earlier the better. I spoke about that kind of golden opportunity between we've tried our best to solve this. We've tried to get people to meet, to talk, whatever. But those efforts have made some ground, but they've petered out.
Mhm.
And that I guess is the moment where you say, well, we need to do something a little bit differently. We need to bring a different perspective into this process, because otherwise it's just costing us too much money, and making that commercial decision to say the cost of trying to manage this problem is just becoming intolerable. We can't let this continue. So that's where we need to maybe bring in some outside help to unblock it.
Mhm. And we talk about that early intervention a lot, and it can be, it is the best approach. What what do you think stops people? You've talked about the cost, and actually it can feel like an added expense. Sometimes we can feel like we may be able to sort the problem out internally ourselves through HR, through managers, etc. But what do you think stops people from stepping in when they first notice that tension?
Um, I think there's from a leadership point of view, it may be that if I put my managing director hat on, from days running, it was like, think this is my job. I should
Yeah.
be able to solve this. Why am I not able to solve it? And it can be that, you are the problem, that it is the manager who is the problem. Almost inevitably in a workplace setting, there is some element of, manager and report who are in conflict. So saying, well, we need external help can feel like a failure of leadership. But you just have to be honest with yourself and say, what we're doing is not producing results. So we can continue to do the same. We can continue to have another meeting, another meeting, and another meeting, but the last six haven't produced any. So, this is now costing us money. This is costing serious money, and we run the risk of losing this person or losing that customer because these two people are key to retaining that customer, but they're not working together properly. So you can put some hard edges on the numbers of failing to deal with it or failing to solve the problem. And you can just make it, like I say, a very commercial decision to say, well, the risk of failure is £50,000. The cost of bringing somebody in is 1,000.
Yeah.
Those are simple numbers to do. And um, the mediation is not a particularly against a loss down the track, a financial loss down the track, or just continuing to throw management time at it. It's pretty cheap. Um, so it shouldn't be a difficult commercial decision to make.
No, and that makes, when you think about the big picture as well, when
Yeah,
it's not just between those two people and perhaps, their teams as collateral, it's bringing in that management piece as well. And what else could they be thinking at? Especially, your background is in very like people focused organizations
yeah,
where people are the product, people are, bringing their revenue generating very, very directly almost in that agency model. So it's key. You've got everyone focused on the right things.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and
And
I
I can say customers sense it as well. If you've got a,
mm,
a client team who are, your advisors or whatever, it's something that customers sense a mile off. If there's dysfunction within their support team, then yeah, it's really obvious. Um, and there is that sense of disputes are or workplace friction is like an iceberg. Only 10% of it is visible. And once you start looking at it and start examining it, then you realize that, crikey, this runs really deep and that this is making people very unhappy below the surface, and they're taking it home and they're starting to look at jobs, the exit strategy, all those things that suddenly can bite you, and then you suddenly get that kind of, oh well, you know, it's got to a head. I can't take it anymore. I'm gone.
mm. And where do you think that line is between, manager or HR having that difficult conversation and trying to manage that through to actually there's a tipping point where you need to bring a mediator in? Is there,
I,
we've
I
talked a lot
think,
about board disruption and stuff, but is there like some signals or something that's a little bit clearer cut where there's like almost a tipping point in it?
well,
Mm.
it, 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 it falls to the HR manager because I suppose, in simple terms, if you've got a dispute with a colleague, then very often HR is the first port of call. That they are seen as the the middle, I don't know, the fulcrum, should we say, between leaders and team. Um, that and so therefore they should be the ones that deal with it. And I go back to what I was saying before, is that HR ultimately they have to represent the long-term best interests of the organization. So they are, guided by, they are funded by the board. Um, so they have that they can't be entirely dispassionate uh, in a dispute. So it comes to that point where the HR function needs to say, we've done our best. We need that independence that we can't find. But by definition, you can't find somebody independent of the organization within the organization. So it's just, it's natural to find that from elsewhere. Some organizations may have a non-exec director or something like that. But again, that non-exec director, it sort of sits on the board. So there's, where are you going to turn for genuinely
Mm.
dispassionate, totally neutral advice from somebody who doesn't have a dog in the fight?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think the ones that do follow that path probably do wish they'd done it sooner as well. In your experience, we've got a question here. What percentage of mediations have worked in that conflict is resolved, or is it not that simple?
Sorry, I didn't hear the
That's all right.
sound dropped.
I was saying, in your experience, what percentage of mediations have worked in that conflict is resolved, or is it not as simple as that?
Well, I go back to that ACAS CIPD study, which is of, I think, 315 HR managers, directors, who put the success rate at 74%, of, and the measure there was, has entirely resolved or largely resolved the conflict. Um, and that kind of 74, 80%, figure is you'll find that quite repeated quite often
Hmm.
in mediation circles. So I think it's a fairly reliable stat, that.
Awesome.
Um, and yeah, I mean, it is defined by, has this made a big impact on the problem? Because it may be a bit ragged at the edges. Has it completely solved it? No, but 90% of it is fixed, and we're back to square one. No workplace relationship is ever 100% perfect. So one that's been, in dispute, or has been, there's been some bruises on either side, it's probably never going to be 100%. But yeah, people sign up to that 74%.
That's yeah, that's a good number. Um, I don't know what I was expecting, but that's I think larger on the larger side. We've got a couple of questions here in the chat as well. Would you always suggest that mediation should happen face to face, at least at some point, or could it be successful over video as well? Obviously, we are working in a more remote first world these days, so
Yeah,
um,
yeah. I mean, my inclination would always be to do it face to face, just because you get so much more,
mhm,
body language, intonation, all that stuff is a bit blurred by Zoom. But remote can be the only solution. And for some people, who are really locked down and can't, physically, have found it problematic to be in the same room, that can be, that distance of a screen can be the best way forward.
yeah,
The important thing to say is, what do the participants want? what do they believe will be the best method. So, that the organization shouldn't mandate that, it should be a choice for the participants. But just from a personal point of view, I'd rather be in the room with people,
Mm.
just seeing those tiny little, kind of little bits of body language, the looks to the ceiling, the looking away, all those kind of little things that are blunted by Zoom.
Mm. And there's a second part to this question as well, which is there a place for mediation with more than two participants? So, if conflict has between two has
Yeah,
maybe spilt over into teams, factions,
yeah,
um, can you have that successful mediation, or is there other
yeah,
things that could
yeah,
derail?
absolutely. Yeah, you can mediate between groups of people. Um, it's a bit more complex because there are a lot more voices in the room, and you may have within one set of participants and another, you may have differences of opinion about how bad or how much of a conflict this is. So, there are more voices in the room, um, but yeah, but it is doable, but just a bit more juggling for sure. I'd rather do
Amazing.
that face to face than on Zoom.
Yeah, that yeah, that would be very impressive. We are getting a few more questions in. Do get your I'll do a final call for questions because we've probably got 10, 15 minutes and I've got a couple as well I want to get in. So we've got another lovely one here that is around, is there any different considerations needed for mediation when people might be neurodiverse? You're talking about the importance of things like body language, and that could be, misleading or complex for someone who struggles with eye contact. So I'm guessing for you, that's probably two parts to that, isn't it? How you would
Sorry,
prep and
can you just summarize the question again, Lucy? I think your mic breaks up a
oh,
little. There we go.
sorry. Is there any consideration needed for mediation with people who might be neurodiverse?
Yeah.
So you're talking about the importance of body language. Is there yeah, anything
Yeah, I
there?
mean, you can have in a mediation, you can have someone as a support, who is not going to participate other than to be, that person who just that their presence can help that. They would obviously have to sign the mediation agreement. We didn't get into the mediation agreement, but both participants have to sign a mediation agreement
Hmm.
beforehand, which protects confidentiality, which um, protects the work what is said in the mediation can't be used in a future tribunal. It is without prejudice in the legal sense, the legal sense. But yes, I mean, you say you can have somebody alongside you as a support, providing that there's balance between
Yeah.
the two. So you couldn't have two people actively mediating against one person or with one person, because you've just got a power imbalance in the room. Um, and it's, that can't be allowed to happen. But I think, as the job of the mediator should be to be absolutely alive to people who have issues around or challenges of confidence or challenges of articulating how they want to make points.
Hmm.
Um, Not everybody is fluent, lucid. They may have language obstacles, and so yeah, the mediator has to work that bit harder in that initial conversation to build trust in the process, those private conversations. And in the mediation session itself, anybody can say, time out. The mediator can, participants can, they can just sort of say, look, this is just getting a bit much. And it's like, fine, we'll pause for a minute. And if there's something that is emerging during the mediation, which as mediator, I think, oh, this changes things completely, I can pause it and we can go into private session. and just sort of say, okay, well, you've raised something there which is new. Can we just talk about that for a few minutes? And if somebody's feeling a bit overwhelmed, then again, as I say, that they can call time out. We can go and have a private conversation to say, how is this making you feel? We can, just dial things down a little bit, just try to get some perspective on how they're feeling at that precise moment, and then hopefully they can regain their flow and the mediation can continue.
It sounds to me like the process is very flexible. So, you've got
Yeah.
those private sessions where you get to know everyone, understand, um, if there is any adjustments to be made, any preferences or inclusions they need, and then that's kind of taken forward into the sessions. And the sessions, as a group session, are very much in their control as well. So, yeah, hopefully
Yes.
that answers the question. For you, Jen. I've actually had another one as well, which is, do you have a real life example of a successful round of mediation and a real life example of a not so successful one?
Well, the successful one would be that CEO and the head of marketing I mentioned. 12 years working together. Um, the CEO, had a lot of issues that which were behind. When the
Mm,
when I began the private call with the CEO, that person was describing behaviors which, when they were first described to me, I was thinking, wow, this sounds like instant dismissal stuff. I'm struggling to understand why we're going towards mediation. But when within the space of 40 minutes, it became clear that that person had a whole load of other baggage around their role in the organization, how they'd arrived at their position in the organization, and how they felt that they were perceived in the organization, which was filtering all the behaviors through that. And the other participant, the head of marketing, again, after some careful questioning and teasing out of some of the issues in that private conversation, realized that, what they felt was reasonable behavior. They reflected fairly quickly and realized that, how it was being perceived elsewhere. And
mm,
the the job, the task in those private sessions is, as I say, to build trust to the point where, as mediator, you can ask some open-ended but quite pointed questions, which kind of go down the kind of, well, how do you think that would make the other person feel? If you just said that, if the person where you're mediating with could have heard you just say that, what do you think would be going through their minds? And how do you feel about that? And then as a mediator, then you shut up and you let them talk and talk and talk. And then bit by bit, their ideas form around how they think they're perceived, how the other person, you sense the shift in their perception of the other person. So rather than being filtered through, they did this, they did this, they did this, they you begin to feel that, well, I can see that when I did that, that prompted that response. So I can see that I had a role in that response.
mm,
And then that begins that process of moving from, here is my position that I'm very angry about and I'm locked in and, I feel aggrieved about. And here's a, something's emerging now from the mist about what I want this to feel like in the future. And the clever bit then is to go, okay, well, what are the 3, 4, 6 stepping stones from how you feel now to how you think you can feel, how you realistically think you can feel within a short period of time, within a week or 2 weeks, and that still feel that way, feel that you will still, be confident that what you're agreeing will still be in existence in 3 or 6 months' time. Because there's no point agreeing stuff in a mediation to kind of make me feel happy, to say, well, I agree that, we will have a weekly meeting and, we will be totally honest with each other and blah, 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 blah. And if you don't mean it, if you're just saying it to get through the meeting, then it's just been a waste of time for everybody. You can only really mediate successfully with stuff that you believe in yourself, that you believe you can live up to.
Yeah.
So that's why I say the hard work, the real hard work, is done by the participants. It's quite mind-bending for the for the mediator as well in the day. It's not an easy day of just sipping coffee and watching people chat. Um, but the real hard work, the decisions are made by the participants, absolutely not by the mediator.
It's so interesting, and I think that piece about we can all say we'll change, but actually, can we actually stick to that change? It's very much like the New Year's resolutions piece, isn't it? Um, we've really got to focus on that commitment. There's a question in the chat, but I've actually got one I want to ask just before because I think they tie in quite nicely
Okay.
together. So obviously conflict as a broader, I guess, topic is expected and sometimes, welcomed in a way in teams and in workplaces. We do, it's often for us where our best ideas come from is when we're coming at things from different places. But you've got to have the right culture and environment for that. So I guess the first part of my question is, what does a workplace that handles conflict well actually look like day to day? Do you see that a lot? What are the behaviors and norms that kind of make those conversations, where it is just conflict, feel normal rather than scary?
It goes back to that point I made about psychological safety, which is the belief that I will be listened to, but what I say will actually be acted on. Not
Hmm.
necessarily, it's not a guarantee. You can't just have everybody has their say and the organization blows with the wind. But where organizations listen to opinions and perhaps through the mechanism of online research and through surveys of attitudes, but we've all filled in surveys and think, well, nothing will change, and it's kind of a waste of time. So there has to be that belief of there is an opportunity for my opinion to be voiced, to be shared, to be put forward, but I have a belief that within reason it will be acted on, that people will think about it carefully, and um, if it's rejected, if my idea is rejected, it's rejected for logical reasons, not dismissed out of hand, and that brings that sense of psychological safety that my opinions are trusted and considered and hopefully acted on within reason, within the corporate goals, um, and that therefore I feel more open to sharing opinions, to being truthful about my work and how I feel, and that, where you feel that your opinion is valued and trusted, then your attitude to the work in hand is always going to be improved. And that's why this research that Google has done around psychological safety in high performing teams is really interesting. And I think a commitment to mediation in the organization is part of that. It's
Hmm.
saying that we as an organization don't always have the answers. So we are prepared to bring outside help in to help us solve things where our best efforts are not producing the result that we want. So it can be a marker of an enlightened organization, I suppose. That there are mechanisms in place through Stripe or whatever to sample, to get opinions from people, but also to say, and this is how we solve problems when they become intractable, because sometimes they are.
And it really feeds into that. As you were talking, I was thinking about how it feeds into that full kind of employee engagement piece. If I don't feel valued, I might not respond as well to a conversation or an idea that's coming from my team. If my mental health is down or my physical health is down, I don't necessarily have the capacity or the energy to be able to handle a slightly more difficult conversation from a colleague. So you can start to see how I guess the engagement of your full team starts to play into some of, where you may have those daily disputes or a little bit of conflict or whatever, where you can start to see how that can kind of play into your organization's health around this as well. but kind of moving on a little bit into Peter's question here. So he's asking a little bit more about kind of daily conflict. They get a lot of different personalities in the room. Sometimes there are some clashes. Most have been resolved, but would you suggest kind of always documenting mediations, even if it's a my words, a smaller dispute that's been resolved on the shop floor? Do you think it's worth passing to HR? Kind of where does that boundary lie when it's, maybe inter-team versus something that feels a bit bigger?
Well, I think a mediation, I'd love it for mediation to be involved in every aspect of every decision, but that's a waste of money. The if it's a day-to-day friction, if it's just someone kind of said something a bit wrong and it went down, they chose their words badly, they said something that the sort of thing, those kind of things that can blow up, but they're outliers for that person. Nigel said something a bit off in that meeting. It's like that, but that's not like him. It's like, yeah, well, move on. But if Nigel keeps coming back to this and it becomes an issue that this is part of Nigel's personality and how he presents in the workplace, then you as an individual need to say, well, that this is becoming an issue. I need to raise it with somebody else. I need to take soundings from a trusted colleague. And lots of mediation happens day to day. People solve problems. Nobody goes, well, one or two people go into the workplace seeking conflict. There are bullies, there are people who enjoy belittling people, unfortunately. But in the main, people can fix things. That somebody has a quiet word, somebody can just sort of say that just felt a bit off the way you handled that. Is everything okay? Did you mean it? Is there something deeper that needs to be discussed? But it's when it gets to a pattern of behaviour, and when you as an individual see that there's an outcome here which is not good for the organization and is not good for the individual, that there is a human cost or a financial cost to this behavior, that is where you would probably then bring in HR to say, this is more than one off. This is a pattern of behavior. It is having this consequence for the individuals involved. It's having this consequence for the function of the team, the performance of the team, whatever. Try to put some parameters on it, and then it then falls to HR to say, well, how far do we take this in terms of internal solution? And if going back to that Goldilocks period of we've done our best, but the efforts are now no longer producing any results. They're dwindling. There's a tail off in terms of effectiveness of our internal efforts, but we can see the future, and doesn't end well. Then you've got that opportunity to try and stem the problem by bringing in somebody from outside. So it's like a lot of things. It's a long piece of string with
Yeah.
somebody said something a bit daft. They just, I don't know, they lost concentration and they just said something a bit odd, through to this person is persistently bullying, is persistently belittling somebody. They are making that person's life hell, whether that's upwards in the organization or downwards. That needs to be resolved, because that is ending in a very bad place.
Mm. Amazing. Thank you. And we've just got, I'm going to squeeze 2 minutes out. So I'm going to ask you, if there's one thing people could take away from today, what would that one thing be? If there's like a parting wish, a parting thought that you would like to leave the audience with, what would that be? Big question.
uh, I suppose it's mediation's great, but it has limits.
Yeah.
It is not a magic wand, um, and it shouldn't be in any way seen as a failure of leadership or management to want to bring in somebody from the outside who can who can try to create a space that can't exist in the organization,
Hmm.
that neutral bubble where people can enter and feel trusted and valued and listened to, and can best solve the problem. And I keep going back to that is once you're in that mediation process, you are doing really hard thinking for yourself around how you want to solve it. It is not you are not a neutral, you're not a passive participant in mediation. You are the most active person, in that process. Um, but it has limits, which hopefully I've tried to to expand on.
Yeah, you've been great, Nigel. Genuinely, thank you. That
It's been a
was really
pleasure.
calm, really clear, and I think exactly what a lot of people today needed to hear. One thing I will say, actually, I forgot to say in our little pre-chat is when I end the webinar, we will not see each other again. So, I just thank you from the team as well for being so supportive of this webinar. I've just launched another little poll, just about Stripe, just seeing if anyone wants to hear from us, etc. So that's there for you. Thank you so much, Jen, for that lovely feedback. We really appreciate the questions that everyone has shared. Nigel shares more of his thinking over on LinkedIn. We'll drop his details in the follow-up email. He's well worth getting in touch with, well worth following, well worth keeping in touch with. He is genuinely given me a lot of confidence and clarity with these things. A huge thank you as well to everyone who's joined us today. The questions have been brilliant. It says a lot that so many of you showed up so ready as well to have this conversation so openly. Conflict is one of those topics that can feel quite difficult to talk about sometimes. So it was lovely to see so many of you here. We'll send a follow-up email shortly with the recording and a few resources to help you take today kind of forward in your own organizations, and also encourage you to keep in touch with Nigel. One small ask though, if today gave you something useful, maybe a reframe, a new way to approach a conversation or a situation, or just the confidence to have that conversation with someone that maybe you've been putting off a little bit, do share it on LinkedIn, maybe in your next team meeting, with a colleague, wherever feels right for you. The more we can normalize talking about this stuff, the more we can focus on taking those takeaways into our daily life, the better it gets for everyone. And if you're thinking about how to surface what's really going on for your people, maybe starting to understand where that psychological safety, belonging, or feeling valued comes before it maybe reaches that conflict stage, that's exactly what Strive's built for. We'd love to have a conversation, so please do reach out. And thanks again. Take care of yourselves, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks, Nigel, too. We'll see you
Thank you.
soon. Bye, everyone.